So look, let's launch into this. We have only 1 hour, and we have a really distinguished panel that I'm sure many of you are looking forward to hearing from specifically. So I don't want to spend too much time talking. Perhaps just to note a couple of quick points, and then I'll introduce the panel. Today is International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women. And it's the start of the 16-day activism campaign that we do every year to end violence against women. Perhaps also to note that this webinar is really timely. Many of us who are working in the midst of operations with the most vulnerable are working hard to really look at how to ensure that PSEA, sexual violence against those who are the most vulnerable and who we're there to actually serve and protect is stomped out. And we've come far as a system, and in fact we have leaders who on the panel who have been central to the gains that we have made. But we're not naive. We have a long way to go, and so this is an opportunity to really have a hard look at ourselves as a humanitarian system and discuss some of those issues. So with that, let me turn to introducing our distinguished panel. They're all renowned in the international sphere as champions for fighting for the rights of people and for the most vulnerable in the world that we live in. Firstly, let me introduce Ms. Zainab Bangura. Currently, she is the Director General of the United Nations Office in Nairobi. She has served as the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, and she's also co-chaired the Oxfam's Independent Commission on Sexual Misconduct, Accountability and Cultural Change. She's certainly a leading voice in the area of ending violence against the most vulnerable people that we work with, and she's previously also held several senior ministerial positions with the Sierra Leone government. So welcome. Also to introduce Ms. Kelly Clement. She serves currently as the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees. And as many of you know, the UN Refugee Agency currently is a leading champion for the humanitarian system on PSEA and has made a lot of progress in moving us forward in that area. Previously, she's also held several senior portfolios with the US government, both in the diplomatic service and as a member of the State Department senior executive team. So we're thrilled that she's joined us today. And then to introduce our third panelist, Ms. Geeta Anani. She is the founder and director of ABAD, a non-government organization based in Lebanon. It's a resource center for gender equality and a leading civil society organization in Lebanon that's fought for women's rights and the political participation of women with several notable successes. ABAD received the first prize, the UN SDG Action Award for the most impactful campaign globally in 2019 because precisely it did achieve significant gains for women. And of course, Geeta herself has been honored by several accolades, including the World Bank as one of the world's 10 inspiring women entrepreneurs making a difference across the Middle East, and selected by the UN Solutions Summit as one of the 10 most extraordinary solution makers across the globe advancing the SDGs. So as you can see, we have quite a distinguished panel. I'm very honored to be moderating this discussion today. So let's launch in, shall we? Let me start with perhaps the first question to Zainab. Zainab, we'd be interested in hearing from your experience and your insights, what enabling factors for sexual exploitation and abuse what are the enabling factors that humanitarian leaders should be aware of to help inform their efforts to proactively mitigate the risks of sexual exploitation and abuse by humanitarian personnel? Zainab, can I hand the floor over to you?
Thank you very much, Rena. I want first and foremost to thank you all for inviting me to participate. You know, I feel extremely inadequate to come here and tell you what needs to be done. You know, whatever intervention I make doesn't come from a professional perspective. It comes from an ordinary and my years of being involved. I lived in Sierra Leone during the war. I was an activist, so I interacted quite a lot. I saw all the challenges. I was in Liberia for 2 years, and in my previous job in the UN and SRSG on sexual violence and conflict, I traveled across the world in all 5 continents. So I just want to talk about practical experience from a layman's point of view. So I think the first challenge I have experienced, I see, is to take a realistic look at the context in which humanitarian people operate, you know. And I'm not talking about, okay, there are earthquakes, there are conflicts, there are tsunamis, but in these cases, in a lot of those cases, you have very little semblance of state apparatus, hardly any rule of law, especially in conflict areas where there is extreme poverty, vulnerability, desperation, where sometimes people are destitute, homeless, poverty, weak or corrupt government officials. And you also have a lot of cultural and traditional norms that which, you know, makes it very difficult for you to define exactly for community to understand when you talk about, you know, sexual exploitation and abuse. And if you take, for instance, you have a family that have a 13 or 14-year-old, you and I know it's underage. But then somebody thinks he falls in love, he starts giving them food and money. The family survival depends on that child. How do you explain to that community this is a crime? So, because sometimes the things that happen, the victims we see them as victims and survivors. I agree it's bad, but you want the community to be able to report it, to understand, to see it as a crime. How do you deal with it? So the context in which these things happen makes it very difficult, because the humanitarian workers in most of this crisis work with very little supervision, whether from government or whether from bosses. And they take most of the decision. You know, the supervision, you can't get supervision from civil society. Maybe a colleague from Lebanon will tell us, I've been to Lebanon and I saw all the challenges that people are facing. So when you're putting these processes and systems or structures in place, think about the context where these people are working. I remember when we were doing the Oxfam, people were talking about the crisis of the Rohingyas and how young girls are being taken into hotels by their own family, and how the number of prostitution increased. It's a survival, this is the survival mode they are, you know, and I remember when I was in Liberia, in the middle of nowhere, where there is no government presence, there is no road, there is no electricity, there is no supermarket, there is no school. Then you have a peacekeeping mission, they have their generator, they have everything. You know, those environments are very conducive for those things to happen. How do you engage the community? How do you tell them? I experienced that in Liberia. I was living next to a battalion, I don't want to call the name, and every time there's a new set of military who comes in, you see the queue of people coming in because they know these ones have not gone the proper training yet. They don't understand what they are going in. You know, so for me, understanding the content, so when you're developing a system to address this issue, you need to understand the context in which you are operating, the circumstances in which you are putting people. They also are overstressed. There are challenges, the people who are staying there, who are working, who you are sent there. So it makes it very difficult. And when you start saying, oh, we need to support the community, this is afterthought. I remember one of the things I admire about the now SG, when I was SRSG for sexual violence, we discussed when you're building refugee camps, how do you put in place the prevention? Because one of the things we discover in Somalia is that the bathrooms are right at the back of the tent. And this is when women go to use the bathroom at night. That's when they get raped. The camps don't have doors. So in Somalia, the military and the police were in the camps, the IDP camps. And because that's where food is being provided. So women who are single parents with their daughters have these men come in the middle of the night, their tent, and actually rape them and take their food. You know, so what I'm saying is when you're dealing with this issue, it's extremely important to think about the content in which you are working on it. And what is the things you put in place? It's good for us to sit in New York or Geneva to say, oh, this is what the civil society, you train them, you draw the rules. You know, so for me, I think that's one thing I really think we have to look at. The second issue is, and one of the things we found out in terms of humanitarian delivery, the focus, I think the gap you have is that people get promoted, they get moved on, they get celebrated because of how much they deliver. Very little attention is paid on how they deliver. You know, so you have a history of people from Save the Children. I'm just giving an example. They do this, they fire them. The next thing they are in Oxfam. They say, oh, this when he was deploying Khartoum, this is how many water wells he built. This is how much he delivered within a period. Do we stand by and think, okay, our commitment is how do we prevent sexual exploitation and abuse? How did this man deliver? What was the relationship with the staff? How did he engage the community? What did he do? Do we have a mechanism to document that, to get people feedback, so that we can assess people, not only or how many water wells or blankets he distributed, but how did he engage? What did he do? What was his history? So I think that's one area which I think we also have to pay attention. And I believe, to be honest, I believe there's in this circumstance, there's a lot of benefit of the doubt given to perpetrators. When somebody is alleged, there's so much time we defend. We're vulnerable ourselves. We try to protect our colleagues. We defend them. We're too sympathetic on them. We say, well, he was working under stress conditions, so on and so forth. But we never understand what does the community feel. How do the people who are committed? You know, we need to take ourselves off from the situation and be very realistic to engage community, because we put systems in place, but we think for the community. We say, okay, these are the benchmarks. This is how you report. This is who you talk to, without understanding what are their own local mechanism of accountability. How do we understand that, in which they're comfortable, in which they can be able to talk, instead of having a pen and a pencil, you know, talking, listening. You know, and when I dealt with women in Colombia, because they said they report to so many people, after they get re-traumatized over and over, because the mechanism of reporting to the health people, to the investigators, so on and so forth. All of those things we have to put in place, so that when we deal with community, we understand what is important to them. Last not the least, I think, is the lack of sophisticated systems to catch perpetrators. You know, these people, they are always ahead of us. They move from one place to the other. You know, when I work with the Oxfam, we found out that those people, a lot of them who are committing this crime, they hop up. So in the humanitarian world, how do you develop a database? If you have worked in Oxfam, you have a record, general record, because sometimes you don't keep the proper record. Then, if he goes to work to Oxfam, he doesn't get employed because the record follows him. You know, we need to be honest and say, okay, we have a lot of bad apples, but I have to say we have a lot of wonderful people who are doing great job. But amongst us, amongst you, there are people who, for some reason, take advantage of the vulnerability of people. You know, and for them, it's not a crime, but the arrogance with which they do it, the impunity, because they know they'll get away with it. There's nobody to monitor them. There's nobody to see them. You know, the people who are there doing it, so do they know it's a crime? Do they understand it? These people are in a survival mode. You know, I saw that in my country when somebody gets a woman, a respectable woman, not once, not twice, who had to go to prostitution because she needs to feed her children. When you get to that situation where even prostitution is not a crime, you know, I had a problem when I participated in the special court to be able to get people to understand that forced marriage, it's a crime. But people said no, because in my own country, the law is that the parents can actually take a decision on behalf of the child who is underage. So these are all the child. How do you explain to somebody in my village that somebody comes to a village and said, I want your child to sleep with me or to go and spend time with me and I give you money? That it's not, you're not doing them a favor. How do you explain it to them? So, these are the basic things we have to understand that, in dealing with this issue, it's good to sit in Geneva, to write all the nice systems, the procedure, the processes, the laws of this. But when you come on the ground, how do you implement, do you turn these things to solutions on the ground that will make a difference in the people's life? Remember, you're talking about humanitarian crisis. Something happens, look at what is happening with Ethiopia. When people end up there, when do you have time to train people? When do you have time? So last but not the least, I think as you discuss these issues, I think it is important for you to also be able to, I'm happy you're saying that RCs are here. We don't wait for RCs to discuss these issues. We need, how do we work to enlighten communities, to work with them at the phase where you have the different development agencies, so that when the crisis happens, people can understand this problem, that possibilities will happen. This is where we report. So I think you have to tie, the humanitarian have to tie to the development. How do you make sure this discussion does not remain with the humanitarian people? How can we encourage it to be discussed at a time when there is peace, so that nobody knew a year ago this was going to happen to Ethiopia? But if a lot of work has been done on Ethiopia, listen, this is a possibility, a challenge. This is what you do. Systems are put in place, explanation given to the communities, they know. So people can react when they have the knowledge, and knowledge is power. So, so I think, I know that it's, but it's a very difficult situation. And I have to thank the humanitarian, because a lot of work has been done. But because there is a systematic failure in the system, so we need to look at the mirror and say, why is it that despite all the effort we're doing, why is this still having this problem? So we need to go back to the drawing board and say, maybe there's something we're doing, we're not doing it right. How do we make it better? I think that's what. So instead of backing yourself with cane, but is to look at yourself in the mirror like you open, to say, what can we do better? Where do we focus on? Why are we focusing on top down? What do we do from down, bottom up? And in the process, who are the other players we need to partner? Who are the strategic partners we have to develop relationship with, that we don't wait until there's an humanitarian crisis for us to be able to respond? Because at the end of the day, all we want to do is to distribute food. People are starving. That's the priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A really potent set of reflections, very useful. And we'll come back in the conversation for a number of areas I'm sure others want to pick up on, particularly around, it is a time for honest reflection and a look in the mirror for sure. We're seeing that in a number of countries where this issue is popping up at an alarming number and scale, and certainly the quality of response. And so whilst we've come far, as you said, we also need to look at why we're still having such large-scale situations where PSEA is apparent in some of the responses. Let me for a moment turn to the other area that we're also working on and have some way to go, and that is around assistance to survivors. So maybe there, Guido, if I could come to you to just sort of reflect a little bit from your experience on what are the key gaps that are preventing effective support to survivors. I think we've already heard some of the cultural and contextual issues that are relevant to this as well, and maybe some practical steps that humanitarian leaders can take to provide effective support to survivors. So Guido, over to you. I think, Guido, have you tried? I can't see if you've unmuted, but we can't hear you yet.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you. So you're going to share the slides from your side, right?
Yes. Great. Over to you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, and thank you for the space, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to try to highlight, with a quick snapshot on the situation of sexual exploitation and abuse in Lebanon. As you know, we're a very unique country on the level of intersectionality between patriarchy and failure of state responsibility when it comes to due diligence towards survivors of GBV, the provision of services. In addition, with a highly confessional country with highly politicized service structure and even the entire social protection response structure. So nowadays, this year, I have to say, adding on this complexity, we have the COVID-19 health situation. We have a very unique economic and financial crisis that led even to the banking sector collapsing. We have new challenges to service providers responding to the health emergency and the protection needs of vulnerable groups, with the very drained health sector, with the question of COVID, the prioritization of clinical management of rape services, or the prioritization of sexual exploitation per se is kind of least priority with everything happening. We are having to adapt the service delivery modalities over and over and over throughout the year because of the multi-layered crisis that we lived in, especially after the latest Beirut blast as well. And lastly, we have the increased, also failing of the services availability per se. In the key gaps in the response, looking at analyzing the situation, one key and essential question is how much the right holders, they know and they trust the reporting mechanisms. Accessibility to information, accessibility to the service itself, to be able to report on. There's the general stigma and fear of SEA in the community and what might be result in if we are to report on, especially with the governing social norms and the risks of risking your life. If you talk about sexual assault at large and the victim blaming and the stigma, there's the lack of knowledge on how, where, and when to report. And here I would invite also the response sector to look at how we make the information adapted and accessible and tailored to different target groups. Sorry, if we can go back just the slide before, the previous one. And there's the lack of trust in itself. The next one, please. And how much it can be efficient if we are to do that, and the fear of losing the services, especially for the refugee community. There are very few service providers that are trained and qualified on clinical management of rape. There's a high turnover, and also there is the non-prioritization of the service itself in the health sector. Next. Also, what we're seeing in the gap is in the investigation and accountability. We lack capacity on the level of service provider on how to do a gender-sensitive, accountable, really efficient investigation on the level of SEA per se. There are no very clear framework outside the UN system on reporting and being accountable to such kind of violations, and especially when it comes to cases of SEA leading to pregnancy. As you know, in Lebanon, abortion is still illegal. There's a lack of talking about sexual harassment in the workplace, and there's a lack of standard operational procedures across in the private and public sector especially, and there are no unified accountability system. And here I would like to just flag how much we have a divide, and there's a kind of schizophrenic parallel systems when it comes to civil society that is taking over all of the shoulder of the government. The government is very far from these standards still, and there is no political will even to advance on that front. And there's the very advanced, progressive, and sharing of learning on the level of the international community and the UN system. Next. What we consider as essential to be mitigating and addressing those gaps, definitely one is creating the robust reporting channels and build capacities across in a very mainstreamed and holistic way. And here, talking about accessibility, especially across diversity, when we talk about gender and diversity, really apply that in the practice and not only in theory. Talking about ability, age, gender, I would even add sexual and gender identity. And I would add as well, legal statical, because here also we're putting more women and girls at vulnerability. Building trust, and this is really a big and not easy responsibility, how we can tailor the information, adapted and channeled on the communal level, but also how we ensure that we can deal with the situation without retaliation and without backfiring, and really gain the trust of right holders themselves to encourage them to report. And this will not happen if we don't communicate the results of accountability, and we make sure that there is a kind of perpetrator really put in impunity and really held accountable per se, and having HR strategies, of course, and mainstream them into institutional policies and procedures. Next. Lastly, I will talk about finding solutions to build investigation capacity locally. And here we need to see how we can engage legal actors and protection GBV experts across different sectors, develop detailed strategies and policies and national accountability framework, and disseminate that to all actors, especially in high-risk sectors like even wash and livelihood and distribution. Last slide. Okay, the final thoughts. I would say, like, really, if we don't put the women and girls at the heart, really in the practice, as a centered approach, people-led process, in thinking with us on how we address SEA, we will not be able to really find and reach a concrete change in on that front. When it comes to capacity and resources sharing, it should happen intersectorally and across multiple platforms, and it needs to be accountability, a shared responsibility, not only within among the humanitarian actors, but I would say also having that contagious on the level of the public sector, which really can drive a change in the community itself. Thinking out of the box, innovation, creativity, making sure that the voice is heard is essential to really drive a change in the life of women and girls in Lebanon and the MENA region, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. Those were really interesting reflections. And, you know, so many of the issues that we're grappling with, just gaining communities' trust, the capacity and expertise we need, reaching deep to the most vulnerable, of course. And, you know, we keep having this conversation about the centrality of the people that we serve being the bottom-up approach that also Zainab referred to, being essential instead of the top-down, telling communities what they need, but hearing how they have the solutions. So thank you with that. We'll come back with some questions, which I already see coming in the chat box. Let me just turn from there, looking at the issues around providing assistance to survivors and how we engage them. The High Commissioner for Refugees has been central to some of the thinking and the practice and support to our leadership in the field. So if I could turn to Kelly to just also reflect a bit on the recent practical tools and initiatives that are available to our leadership that the High Commissioner and yourself have championed discussions on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rena, and I'm delighted to be on this panel. I have to say it's a challenge to translate outrage into action in an hour. But let's whet the appetite of those that are tuning in, and I see quite a large number are, and build on a little bit what the two previous speakers have said. So what if you're in a country office, what do you do? What practically can you do? I mean, look at what we've been dealing with as a system now for the last few weeks with regard to the Ebola experience in DRC. It's not a good situation. You know, this is after we had put in some of these tools and a strengthened approach to preventing sexual exploitation and abuse. And we know that basically this is not something that touches one agency in a particular context. It touches all of us. This is something, one of the reasons why obviously we need to take this incredibly seriously as a system. And as Gita had said, you know, one single incident also for the survivor, for the victim, is absolutely devastating. So taking a victim-centered approach has to be paramount to what we do in terms of moving forward. We have strengthened considerably over the last couple of years, and obviously building, Rena, on the work that Mark and you and others have done within the IASC context, and UNICEF being the prior champion on this particular issue, and UNFPA succeeding Filippo Grande in 2021. What we've looked at as interagency partnerships on this is absolutely fundamental and important. And where we have put our energy and our attention, and where the High Commissioner has really focused, is what good practices actually effect change. So I think as a system, we're looking at the DRC model and experience right now to figure out, so what didn't work? And maybe we can come back to that a little bit in the discussion. But what we've seen is that there's a need for broad and joint engagement. We focused on 3 priorities as a system, and I'd be very interested from the RCs and HCs whether or not you see this resonating in the country context. 1, prevention, prevention, prevention. This has to be, as Zeynep had said, you know, and you, Rena, it's time to take a look in the mirror. What could we have done to prevent what we see now still happening in the humanitarian context, but not exclusively, obviously, across the system as a whole? Second, how do we expand some of the safe spaces that are so critical in terms of the work that we're doing to continue to do and to protect? And third, how do we promote a respectful use of our own authority and the verging and blurring of lines between the authority and power we have in our positions and in our organizations and what we do in terms of delivery to make sure that these aren't used in the wrong way. And there was a clear reference to this in the chat with regard to, particularly on the gender side, gender equity and inequality rather, being really fundamentally at a root. So on the prevention side, our approach has been, this is not about the top, this is about every level of the organization, every person in the organization taking responsibility to prevent, to detect, and to respond to sexual exploitation and abuse. We have worked very hard with partners on a particular package called Saying No to Sexual Misconduct, which is a learning package for partners, which we're going to show a video in just a couple of minutes, but we urge you to download and use in terms of your own dialogue at the country level. This builds on something that the International Organization for Migration did, which was launched in April, but for the system as a whole. It's interactive, it's interesting, it's using your own experience and perceptions in a particular context to better understand how this could happen and how we can prevent it, using testimonies and group discussions. The second main area is in terms of awareness and engagement with regarding to who we serve. And obviously, it's fundamental that the people that we're serving know their rights, know when something's not going well, where do they go, how do they report, how can they be sure that we as a system are going to respond. And I'm happy to say, in response to one element that Zeynep had mentioned, we now have ClearCheck, which is to try to prevent the recycling amongst the system of perpetrators in the system, because in fact that is outrageous and we need to prevent and stop it. We launched in April of this year something called the Preventing Sexual Exploitation and Abuse Community Outreach and Communications Fund, which is really focused at the local level to provide support for local non-governmental organizations closest to the people that we're serving, working on the raising awareness on PSEA and trying to emphasize the non-conditionality of humanitarian assistance, safe reporting, and again, the survivor-centered approach that is so important. We were, Rena, quite simply overwhelmed with the response. We got 1,600 applications from NGOs that we wanted to be part of this community, needed a little bit of support, and we certainly can build on this going forward in the future and would welcome other agencies joining us with ICFA to build on this in the future. This was built this year when COVID and the pandemic was hitting, so it became even more important, and we'll do a second call to build on the 19 we've already supported. And then, of course, there is the leadership issues, the cultural change issues that become so important in terms of preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, the imbalances of power and gender inequalities. We have put together and launched in September a communications package, which is really directed at the senior levels at a country level, but also the Interagency Standing Committee principals, and they will do themselves this learning package in December. But it's focused on values, attitudes, and organizational culture. And it's supposed to be a reflection, but also a reflection, self-reflection, and then one in terms of the agency, and then where you fit within the system, and really intended to change, looking at unconscious bias, values, behaviors, power, and gender differentials. I will use this next month as well, also with the CEB task force on sexual harassment, because there are lots of relevant areas that cross both spheres. And what we're really trying to do is create workplaces that are built on respect, inclusion, and accountability, and strong ethical standards. So in conclusion, what I would say, Rena, is that it really is going to take close collaboration with all of us in terms of learning lessons from the past, but building towards the future. And we can see what role engaged leadership plays in terms of preventing and responding when incidents do happen. But obviously our fundamental goal has to be to eradicate sexual misconduct in the humanitarian and development sectors, making really transformational change. Now, as I understand, Rena, I think I'm to introduce just very shortly this video that we have for the participants. I want to warn you, it is not easy to watch. It does have some elements where clearly sexual misconduct can lead to really violent behavior. So if that bothers you, just turn away for a couple of minutes, but I hope you will watch and see how you might be able to use this in your own context. Thank you very much.
So, Zainab, if I could come to you, one of the issues that we have, even when we recognize we have a problem and we find solutions, we often cannot get the sort of even funding for issues. I mean, during the COVID period in recent months, we know that gender-based violence, not PSEA, but gender-based violence has skyrocketed, and many have called it a pandemic of its own in terms of violence against women. And yet the funding for the first few months, until a lot of heavy lifting by a lot of very senior people happened, was only at 8% for programs that targeted GBV. We're now at 22% funded, which, you know, is still very low. But even on the PSEA side, when we seek funding, it is extremely difficult to raise funds to be able to implement some of the initiatives that we need, and support to survivors. Can I turn to you to reflect a bit about donors' responsibilities in this regard and how we can perhaps move forward in that conversation? Zainab, shall we turn to you first?
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm not speaking as a USG in the UN. I speak as an ordinary person. One thing I can tell you, the instruments that we have in the UN to protect women, and things we have put in place, if we are supposed to negotiate it today, we'll never be able to have them. That's the reality. The growth of voices that are against the whole issue of gender empowerment and gender equity, the voices have grown very high. You have a limited number of donors who are actually putting their money there. I remember when I was in New York, when I traveled in the Middle East, with all the crimes that ISIS had committed. I went to Damascus, I went to Turkey, I went to Jordan. On the humanitarian appeal that's made by, you find out there's a small amount of money allocated for gender-based violence. That is also reflected in national budgets. Yesterday, I was at a meeting with the International Gender Charter, and I think one of the biggest problems we have had in dealing with this issue at the national level is that in terms of pecking order in ministry, the Ministry of Gender is right at the bottom. And when you're at the bottom, you get less money. You get less power, get influence. When I was dealing with sexual violence in conflict, especially when I worked in the DRC, I insisted that I don't get assigned to the Minister of Gender. They had to appoint a special representative because I don't see how the Minister of Gender is going to talk to the Minister of Finance, or the Minister of Gender is going to instruct the Minister of Defense what to do, you know, and they can't listen to him because in terms of pecking order, in terms of resources, that's at the bottom. That's the reality we face. And I think in terms of appeal, how do we peg it to any amount of resources that is donated, a certain amount of it goes to fight this battle? We have to engineer ways and means to tie it. As we say, we mainstream gender issues into development agenda. Let's mainstream support on this issue and tie it to a percentage of resources that is given in any appeal. We have to be creative. But if we're expecting money to be allocated, we have very little partners, either in the Scandinavian countries or depending who is in power. You know, we had a lot of support. Even in my office, I had a lot of support from the UK because William Hague led this as a champion from the foreign ministry. And I can tell you the difference it's made in my mandate when William Hague decided to be a champion, or when Japan, the Prime Minister Abe decided to put this thing in his calendar. That's where it happens. So if we are going to depend on the support, contribution by member states, we're never going to have it. So we have to be creative. How do we generate money? For me, that's my advice. So it's not only on you who are fighting gender-based violence, but even national budgets in countries, people who are working, supporting gender empowerment. You can see the ministries that have to do with gender are the least funded ministries. So the institution that has to be doing with gender are the least funded. The appeal that has to do with gender-based violence is the least funded. When you leave it to people to support, they'll support other things. But how do you tie that, mainstream it, and say, for every dollar we get, this is how much cents we're going to get for gender-based violence? So you actually, maybe that's one I just thinking off my head. But I think it's a pattern, systematic pattern at the international, global, at the regional level, you know, at the national level. So it's a problem we have. So we have to rethink how do we make sure that we have the adequate funding to fund this issue at the national level, at the global level. That's where we can be able to get the money we need. But trust me, my dear, they're not going to put the money there because maybe the people who have the money don't believe in it. That's the reality. That's a fact. Thank you.
It's been interesting, a lot of discussion about violence against particularly women and children over the last few months, but the fact that, and amongst member states, and the fact that we still find it hard to raise the money. So the suggestion of making it a percentage of all programs and build it in is a really important one. And of course, as you said, government programs as well. There's a comment and then a question. So Kelly, I might come to you on this one. The comment, it's an interesting one, and it is one of our times. There's a comment about the fact that the panel, and I guess myself as the facilitator of the discussion, are all women. I will give a reflection, and therefore, why are there no men on the panel, and what's the male accountability? Just a comment on that, and then I'll turn to you. 5 years ago, I remember seeing a similar type of webinar. It was all men. So in some ways, I think we've come far. The other reflection is in DRC right now, and I know we have the Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator. David was unable to make it, but Diego's online, which I'll come to later. In DRC, one of the big noted issues around the response was that it was 100% male, and that may have contributed to part of the problem from the leadership down. So just a comment and a reflection. And then to also ask Kelly, if you want to reflect on any of that, but also to ask a bit more information on the close collaboration that we have now, and particularly around ClearCheck. There are a number of comments about the fact that we have such a high staff turnover, and what are we concretely doing to ensure that perpetrators are not passing on from one agency to another. You did mention that we've progressed on that, but perhaps just another comment specifically on that issue as well. Kelly, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Rena. That's a big challenge. A couple of things. First, on the issue of the composition of the panel, I was not supposed to be the one with you. Filippo Grandi was going to be the one with you, the High Commissioner. He wanted to be here. I should have said and given his apologies in advance, but he is on an airplane to go to Sudan. So I am humbly sitting in on his behalf. So otherwise, we would have had a bit of gender diversity. But indeed, I agree wholly with the question of is submitted in the chat function. We need men involved in this conversation as well as women. And that is indeed one of the reasons when Mark asked Filippo, would he take on this challenge starting in 2019 into 2020, he didn't hesitate but say yes. He believes strongly in it. Internally in the organization, this is frequently part of his communication with our 17,000 colleagues all over the globe. And I know he's put this on the table with Mark at the IASC principles, Mark also being a champion, but this is not going, we're not going to move the needle if we don't have all of us involved in finding the solutions and eradicating sexual misconduct. And that goes both for SEA and sexual harassment, but frankly, any abuse of power, abuse of authority. And I think in terms of that cultural change, it touches many different parts of the organizations in which we're working and becomes fundamentally important. The ClearCheck, yes, I brushed over that quickly, but I thought it was important to say, and I talk about this a little bit more with my high-level committee of management hat on, because this is something we've worked very much in HLCM. But there has been a very firm focus when we put the policy into place on sexual harassment that we wanted as a system, and this goes with sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment, to have a way that those who are either under investigation or there has been an allegation against, that there is some indication in terms of that particular individual that they can't leave an organization, go to another organization when in fact they've got an investigation that is currently pending. This is very important in terms of the UN system, and it has been strengthened considerably in the last couple of years. Where we're trying to make some progress with our NGO friends is to see how we can extend this further within the system, because obviously we've got over 1,000 partners, other UN agencies similarly, and we're all in this together. So it would strengthen the system to have something that's a bit more collective, but we're continuing to make progress. There are a few issues related to that. And if I could on DRC arena, because it is the fresh issue, there are, and we're coming to the top of the hour, there are a few things going back to what Zainab had mentioned in terms of spending, and I was doing a virtual hand clap because we could not agree more that the investment on gender-based violence, there's a direct connection between the paltry level of support for those related activities and programs and what we see in terms of the allegations, the incidents, the issues in terms of prevention. So this is something that's quite important, I think, to the sector. Are you hearing this too?
Yeah, could I just ask all of you to check? There's some really interesting music which I'm enjoying, but we can't hear Kelly. Should I ask you to check your mute button because we have a disturbance? Thank you. Sorry, Kelly, back to you.
It's okay. And I know we have some people on the call who are very involved.
Sorry, there's a radio sound in the background. Could everyone just turn on mute?
Wonderful shot by Bates.
I think it's a TV sound, actually. I don't know what interruption we have. It's Just see if we can actually get the host to turn it off. Okay, sorry.
No worries, no worries. But on DRC, I know that there are some people on this call that were part of the interagency standing committee mission that went to help the country team look at this issue in terms of what could have happened and how we could have prevented what had transpired during the times of Ebola. It is pointing clearly to the lack of spending with regard to GBV programming across the country. It is also pointing closely to the need to build and invest in capacity with regard to PSEA sorts of initiatives. There are issues related to reporting mechanisms, making sure we have clear referral pathways, and issues that we've talked about on this call, Rena, with regard to perceptions, trust in the system, what the survivor, the victim, where they can go when things are not going well. We need to certainly within the system strengthen whistleblower efforts and the like. And it really points to what I said at the top in terms of this interagency partnership and collaboration, a much stronger one. I think in our individual agencies, we know what the processes and procedures are. It's less clear when we come across what's happening perhaps in another agency, making sure we've got the clear modus operandi in place. But I think we're going to take a lot away from that to continue to strengthen within the system. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kelly. That was really interesting, and there's a lot there that we still obviously have progressed on, but need to move further on. We are coming to the hour, unfortunately, and it really feels like we're breaking the conversation short. What I will say is that there are a number of senior leaders on the line who are dealing with this real time at the ground level now. And we'd like to provide an opportunity for you to have a closed conversation peer-to-peer and with some others who have senior leadership experience and practice in trying to work on this at the ground level. So we will be organizing a closed-door peer session, perhaps facilitated by some of the senior leadership that have shown interest in furthering this. And I can certainly confirm to what Kelly said that it's not just the female leadership in the organization. There is a march that's being championed by all colleagues at leadership levels. I think there's a true recognition that now is the time for transformative change. We have progressed, but the whole culture aspect, collaboration aspect, and really starting bottom up has to happen now, and that is a voice loud and clear from all of the leadership. I want to thank our panelists. As I started by saying, they are champions, and Kelly, we were thrilled to have you, of course, as well as Zainab and Gita. Thank you very, very much for your time and for contributing to the conversation. It will be recorded, and there will be a follow-up to this session. So thank you all for joining us. I think we had some 500 participants today, and we will distribute the link to the movie that Kelly, the clip that Kelly was trying to show, and the link to this, and the follow-up session. Thank you very much.